We welcome Adam Weinstein to the Center for Research and Security Studies, Islamabad. Adam Weinstein has served as a Marine in Afghanistan and currently writes for Foreign Policy and Daily Times on security issues in South Asia, including Afghanistan. We asked him a few questions about his insights on the Afghan conflict. So, as the world's been seeing, the Afghan forces have not been able to counter the insurgency in Afghanistan. What do you think went wrong with the Afghan National Army?
In my opinion, what went wrong with the Afghan National Army, that's a difficult question because they do have many good officers. They have had some successes, and there are a lot of dedicated soldiers. On the other hand, there was a lot of incompetence in the Afghan National Army, and I think that's been on display since the drawdown. And there are several factors there. One is that it's just difficult to raise an army from nothing in 10 years. A second factor was that the United States and the NATO forces themselves were still learning how to conduct a counterinsurgency. So it was difficult to teach the Afghan National Army because we weren't really teaching them traditional warfare, traditional conventional warfare tactics. We were teaching them a counterinsurgency type of warfare that, coin, as they say, that we ourselves were still trying to, perfect. And the other issue were ethnic fault lines within the Afghan National Army themselves. Much of the army consisted of ethnic groups that were alien to the Pashtun areas. And then, when there were Pashtun units or units that had many Pashtuns, there was a cultural disconnect between, I was a Marine, between the US Marines and the Pashtun soldiers themselves in terms of how to interact socially, how to train them, how to interact with sort of a society that places honor on a pedestal, versus a society that looks at it a bit of a different way. All of those things made it difficult to train the Afghan National Army, and essentially they were trying to, we were trying to create a startup military within a very short period of time, and in some sense the Afghan National Army can't be blamed because the task was just immense. The other issue was when someone joins the US military, oftentimes they're doing it for patriotic purposes, and sometimes there's other considerations, but they're given an identity as a soldier. They're given a nationalistic identity, a patriotic identity. And that identity was somewhat missing for many of the soldiers in the Afghan National Army, because what it means to be an Afghan and what the state of Afghanistan is still evolving and still developing, and depending on where you're from in Afghanistan, it can mean a very different thing, and so there was a lack of what you'd call esprit de corps in the Afghan National Army.
Why do you think it hasn't been able to develop into a professional army?
So I served as an enlisted Marine, not an officer, and I'm not a professional in terms of how do you train new militaries, and I never served in the DoD or the Pentagon. But from what I saw on the ground, some improvements that could have been made is I think there needed to be perhaps specialized units or perhaps more individuals who had a deeper understanding of Afghan culture and all that it is, including Pashtun culture. I think they desperately needed to demonstrate to individual units in the Afghan National Army the way their mission related to the country as a whole. I think, one of the big problems in Afghanistan, and this is present in the military itself, is there's a disconnect from the center. So if you have soldiers who are serving in Helmand province, there's a disconnect from how their mission relates to Kabul, and there's a disconnect with the local populations. So I think trying to create, and this is what's difficult, trying to create a nationalism. In some ways, the Afghans themselves have to do this. A foreign force cannot create a sense of nationalism. There's no way to engineer a sense of nationalism. That has to develop over time. Now, as the Afghan National Army, makes strides and has achievements in battle, that can itself create a sort of pride in Afghan nationalism. But some of that needs to be, done by Afghan leaders themselves, and I think they are making progress. As to what could the US military have done differently? I think we could have thought about how to train the Afghan National Army within a cultural framework that would have made more sense for them. And I also think we had to, there needed to be more responsibility, more ownership placed on Afghan National Army officers for the conditions of their OPs, the conditions of their troops. Because sometimes there was a real neglect between from the officers towards the regular Afghan National Army soldiers. So those are some things that could have been done differently.
How do Iran and Pakistan fit into the Afghan peace equation?
So, in the case of Afghanistan, I think one of the big roadblocks to achieving a stable economy, a stable military, and a stable country was the U.S. relationship with Iran. And of course, I read the other day that one of the first shipments of wheat from the Chabahar port has reached Zaranj in Afghanistan. And this is a development that could have happened earlier. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. The U.S., the U.S.'s own contentious relationship with Iran in some ways stifled Afghanistan's relationship with Iran because the U.S. was directing the nation building in Afghanistan. And the truth of the matter is that as a landlocked nation, Afghanistan is more dependent on its neighbors than countries that are not landlocked, and this is basic common sense. The other issue was that for whatever criticisms the U.S. has of negative Pakistani interference in Afghanistan, part of the reason that the U.S. had less leverage over Pakistan was because of its terrible relationship with Iran, in which case it made it more reliant on Pakistan. But that's not to say that there shouldn't be a good relationship with both. Afghanistan needs a good relationship with both countries in order to engage effectively in trade. And the reality is Afghanistan has deep cultural ties, depending on the ethnic group, with both Iran and Pakistan. So the U.S. really missed a lot of opportunities. There could have been early cooperation. There was early cooperation between Iran and the U.S. on Afghanistan. And obviously Iran was no fan of the Taliban. Their diplomats had been killed in Mazar-e-Sharif. There was a time in history when it was even, thought that it might be possible that Iran itself might invade Afghanistan. And in the early days after 9/11, it's been reported that Iran shared intelligence with the United States. But that relationship quickly fell apart when the former President Bush made a speech in which he included Iran in the axis of evil, and the rise of Ahmadinejad in Iranian politics didn't help either. So that was really an opportunity squandered. But it seems to me that Kabul is engaging with Iran on its own terms now, independent of United States policy, and I think that's actually a beneficial. I think that's a beneficial development for both Afghanistan and the United States, and perhaps that's what needs to happen. It doesn't seem that the U.S.-Iran relationship is making any strides in the short term, so perhaps the best opportunity is for Kabul to independently develop that relationship between Kabul and Tehran with a United States that allows that to happen, and that might be the best short-term solution right now.
Seeing all that's happening, do you think peace is possible in Afghanistan?
Do I think peace is possible in Afghanistan? I would say yes, because the answer no is unacceptable. But I don't think that we're going to see a peaceful Afghanistan in the near future. I think it's possible to see a peaceful Kabul, possibly a peaceful Herat, a peaceful Mazar-e-Sharif, but but the southwestern areas of Afghanistan are going to remain troubled for some time. And of course, Kabul does not exist in a vacuum. And so long as the rest of the country is unstable, there will be terrorist attacks in Kabul as well, as we've seen. And there is a sort of sectarianism that has infected Afghanistan as well, as we see Hazaras being targeted. But I do think peace is possible. It takes a long time for a country to build a cohesive national identity, especially a country with as many diverse ethnic groups as Afghanistan. However, I think peace in Afghanistan is going to depend on regional peace. I think it very much is interrelated to Pakistan's relationship with India. I think it's interrelated to with the US relationship with Iran.